If you're a brand new player, or maybe a returning player that wants to brush up on your skills, check some rules, or maybe you're a digital player that's trying to work out why the hell monsters do what it is that they do in the game, well, in this guide here, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about monster focus and why monsters do really the things that they do. As always, guys, if you do find the information useful, please consider tossing the video a like and subscribing. I've got lots of Gloomhaven guides already on the channel and loads more to come. We've also got Frosthaven just around the corner, so plenty more Frosthaven videos to come soon too. I also stream live on Twitch at twitch.tv/MandatoryQuest every Monday, Wednesday and Sunday. You can always come check me out live there, or you can join the community Discord server down below if you've got any questions you'd like to reach out and ask. We've got loads of people in there playing Gloomhaven and just, yeah, very knowledgeable people about Gloomhaven in the Discord, so you can always hang out there. Right, now all of the boring stuff's out of the way, let's get into the guide. So let's briefly talk about initiative, because it's going to factor a lot later on. For you, the mercenaries, this is the leading card that you chose, and for enemies, it's printed on the ability card flipped this round. This sets who will act and when and in what order for this round, and it also plays an important part in the monster and summon AI, which we will come back to later. When a player ties with an enemy, the player will always break that tie. But when two or more players tie the initiative order, it's set by the second card chosen by each character. In a very rare situation that may result in both of these things still having a tie, then the players basically decide. It's also important to note that players' summons will always act immediately before that player in initiative, so are always considered to be just ahead of them. However, they don't actually factor in at all in determining the round's initial initiative order. When you have both elite and regular enemies of the same type, then all of the elites of that type will act before the regular ones, and then it's worked out by the standee or enemy number. In digital, you can find this number in the info pane when you're hovering over an enemy in brackets. For tabletop, it's printed on the standee itself. This is why actually in tabletop it's important to draw these randomly and set this up randomly, because the order that they move in could massively affect the flow of the scenario and how enemies are basically going to move around the mission. A quick note about enemy turns. Remember, an enemy will only perform the actions that's on its ability card that it flipped that round. Sometimes this can be a bit confusing. It sounds obvious, but in digital, this is all done for you. But in tabletop, perhaps you might see the stat card and think that an enemy will always perform everything that is on its stat card. This isn't true. You'll only ever do the actions that are flipped that are on that ability card this turn. So don't make the game harder for yourself and make this quite simple mistake. In fact, many enemies have special abilities and signature abilities that they're well known for in Gloomhaven, and a lot of these aren't even attack abilities. Okay, so monster and summon AI follows a pretty simple set of rules, but there is some nuance to it and it can get a bit confusing at times. We use the term focus in Gloomhaven to determine who an enemy will attempt to attack or move towards when it's performing an ability. You're going to be hearing that word focus a lot in the next bit, so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Also, all of this monster AI movement behavior stuff applies to your own summons too, so getting a good understanding of this is important if you want to play a summoner well. Okay, so there are 4 basic rules to remember, really. Rule number 1, monsters are dumb. They have no memory and do not care or plan around future turns. They only care about this turn, here and now. Rule number 2, monsters are lazy. Monsters will never move more than they have to in order to maximize their attack or ability. This might include not even moving at all, and they will only move if it gets them actually closer. Rule number 3, monsters are blind. The closest character to a monster is not always necessarily the closest in proximity. It's actually all about the movement paths and the routes available. And finally, rule number 4, monsters hate damage. Monsters will never spring traps or walk on hazardous terrain unless there is no other option. This includes maybe taking a longer but much safer route that might mean that they don't do an attack at all. Even if they had stepped on a trap, they would have been able to perform that attack. This is actually a really good thing to abuse and to manipulate so that you can force enemies to take really long routes and leave you alone, or go through traps when you want them to. You can definitely use this to your advantage. Okay, so with those in mind, I'm going to break this down into 3 sections for you with some examples. So step 1 is going to be your initial checks. Step 2 is going to be finding the actual focus. Then step 3 is going to be performing the abilities. So step 1, initial checks. Is the enemy stunned? If the enemy is stunned, then it will just immediately end its turn and remove the stun token without using or getting any of the effects of the drawn ability card. Quick note, this does not negate any passive abilities that enemy might already have on their stat sheet, such as shield or retaliate, or perhaps there might be some buffs granted by another enemy, and it also does not negate any active scenario effects that might be in play. If an enemy is stunned, it would also prevent them from taking any kind of gifted or controlled actions, such as those used by the Mind Thief, until that stun token is removed too. To put it simply, until that stun token is removed at the end of its turn, it just can't do anything at all. For the sake of this guide though, let's just say that we aren't stunned, otherwise this is going to be a pretty short guide. Next, is the enemy disarmed? A disarmed enemy is unable to perform an attack, but it does not prevent movement or other non-attack abilities, and a disarmed enemy will still need to find a focus. If the enemy is disarmed or is using a non-attack ability, it will always act as if it has a melee target 1 attack. This can actually seem pretty counterintuitive at times, as ranged or support style enemies will actually move closer towards you into danger, but it's an important mechanic and it can actually help you out with bunching enemies up for AoE attacks and bringing those out of reach enemies much closer into your own range. Remember rule 1, monsters are done. Next, do they have a move action? Does the ability card have a move action, and can you actually move? If it doesn't, or if maybe you're immobilized, then you actually stay put for now and you're going to perform their action if they can from this very spot. So now you've checked all of the conditions on the enemy and what it is that they are doing, we're going to check movement paths and we're going to find eligible hexes where this monster could move to. Starting from its position, the enemy will find paths to hexes it can reach from which it can perform its attack while avoiding traps and hazardous terrain. The amount of movement the enemy actually has this round at this point is actually just irrelevant. If it's possible to reach that hex with an infinite amount of movement, it's an eligible hex. Enemies will always try to get closer if a closer hex exists. One rule that you can use to your advantage with movement and finding these eligible hexes here is that if you go invisible on a door, you basically become an obstacle, which means that there will be no way for the enemy to ever get into your room or past you. And in this case, there would be no eligible hexes in which an enemy could move, so the enemy just will not move at all. If there is no eligible hex that the enemy could ever get into, they will never move. So this is a great way for you to be able to stall a room and stop enemies from being able to act at all. Remember though, flying enemies don't care about obstacles, so flying enemies will move over traps, obstacles and hazardous terrain as they like to find their best position. Remember, if the enemy is disarmed or has a non-attack ability, it acts as if it wants to perform a melee attack target 1. And also don't forget that this hex might also just be what it's currently already on, especially if the enemy is ranged. Rule number 2, baby, enemies are lazy. In the case of ties, so for example a forked path around an obstacle where the amount of movement is actually the same, then the players can decide which route they would prefer. In digital, the game just makes this decision for you so you don't need to worry about it, but sometimes it can lead to some awkward situations when perhaps you wanted some enemy to go to a slightly different hex for other reasons, but unfortunately in digital this has just been done to speed up the gameplay so you don't actually have the option to choose these ambiguities. Great, so now you have some possible hexes and some possible targets for your attack. Probably quite a lot of hexes at this point, so now we need to start narrowing them down because step 2 is going to be finding your focus. So in step 2, finding focus, what we're trying to do is we're trying to find the mercenary that the enemy is going to target or lock on to as going to be their focus for their ability. First off, if there is any hexes that can be reached with infinite movement without triggering a trap or hazardous terrain, then you can straight up disregard any hexes that can only be reached by springing or by walking on hazardous terrain. Rule 4 applies here, folks. Monsters hate damage and they will always take longer routes if they can avoid taking that damage. As the round progresses and more enemies act, other enemies will maybe do you a favor and block free hexes, forcing those enemies to then have to go into traps. Especially in crowded rooms with limited paths, this happens quite regularly. Great, so now we've narrowed down a few more hexes. Now we check which character the enemy can reach with the least amount of movement. Now, in the case of a tie where 2 figures could be reached with equal amount of movement. In Gloomhaven, there's actually 2 tiebreakers to break this. The first tiebreaker that you would use would be which enemy is closest in proximity. So how many hexes physically away from where the monster is when they started, and it would focus that one. If that is still the same, then it will be broken by initiative. Now, this rule seems to have been taken out, this first rule in Jaws of the Lion. Jaws of the Lion only specifies initiative being the only tiebreaker. And that is a nice simplifying of the rules, I think. Perhaps we might see that rule being the future rule. So if you're playing the Frosthaven and you're watching this after playing some Frosthaven, then bear in mind that that might actually be the rule. So it's worth checking. But if you are playing Gloomhaven, then in the rules as written, that is specified as the first tiebreaker, which is proximity, so closest to the enemy. So now we're going to get into step 3, which is actually performing the ability. Up to now, it's all just been about finding that focus. This is where you're going to actually need to read the ability card and follow it from top to bottom and do what the card says. Also taking into account perhaps any passive effects that the enemy might have on their stat card. Enemies with multiple targets or area of effect style attacks will always try to position themselves to do the most amount of damage they can by first focusing their main target using the rules before, then looking for the best position to attack any additional characters too. This might make them slightly less lazy than normal, and they might move some additional hexes to do this if they have the movement. Remember rule 1 though, that they don't plan for future turns, so they wouldn't move to get closer to a multi-target attack if they physically can't perform that multiple target attack this round. So it's not on their card, or they just physically can't move into range to get that second target. If the enemy is attacking multiple enemies, it also applies all previous rules to this new target from its starting position to find its focus. And if you're playing tabletop, any kind of ambiguity you might find here on where the enemy can move is decided by the players. So a few other important rules to really note here. Ranged enemies will always move if possible to avoid disadvantage against their main focus first, and then if possible to avoid disadvantage against any additional targets. A ranged enemy who already has a source of disadvantage because of muddle, for example, they will actually not move away even if they could. As remember, rule 2, monsters are lazy, so moving wouldn't actually remove the effect of disadvantage, as they already are, or improve their damage potential. They also won't take any damage moving through traps or hazardous terrain to avoid disadvantage if they're next to an enemy. You can definitely take advantage of this pro tip, as it means you can force ranged enemies to take retaliate damage potentially. So now the enemy is in position, it can perform its attack, or if it's not performing an attack, it will perform its non-attack ability as well. In the case of a heal, the monster will actually heal the lowest health enemy within range. If it's a case of a summon ability, it will summon in the closest empty hex to that mercenary that it focused. Do remember that monsters will only ever move to prioritize attacks. They won't actually move to prioritize different abilities. So if, for example, an enemy is going to muddle and immobilize a lot of you, they won't actually move in such a way unless the focus would dictate them to. Remember, they're still just performing an ability, so their focus is going to be determined as if they're trying to perform an attack 1 melee attack. Okay, well that pretty much wraps up everything that you need to know about monster movement and monster focus. Hopefully you found the information useful, and if you're a digital player, I think this information is good to know just because it helps you really understand sort of like the mechanics behind the game. I do find that the Gloomhaven Digital tutorial is great and everything, but it does miss out some of the kind of nuances of things that is actually quite useful to know in order to improve as a player. So if you're playing digital, or if this is you're new to the tabletop version or new to Jaws of the Lion, or maybe even Frosthaven now, if you're watching this sometime in the future, then hopefully you might have found this information useful. Well, that's it for another video. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, please hit that like button and consider subscribing. Got lots more Gloomhaven guides already on the channel and loads more to come, as well as Frosthaven content coming soon. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Also, I stream regularly on Twitch at twitch.tv/mandatoryquest every Monday, Wednesday and Sunday. So maybe come hang out and play some Gloomhaven live with me there. But if not, I will catch you guys in the next video. Thank you again so much for watching. Bye.
I think still, yeah.
Oh,
Scout
that's the blessing from Cam.
Yeah.
That's the blessing from.
Isaac, at this point, can we get your approval to add an additional attack modifier deck for allies in the digital version?